All right, y'all. So you've probably noticed from looking at your new note packets that it doesn't look like those new note packets really resemble a lot of geometry. And you are right. We're kind of moving in a different direction for the last unit of this course. And we're going to cover some material that you didn't get to in Algebra 1 due to COVID. But the material we're going to talk about is so important. It has so many real-world applications to it in just everyday life. And so for this unit, we're really going to focus on data analysis and basically how do we analyze data, interpret it, and explain it. Like that's going to be our goal. So before we do that, let's just talk about the types of data that we have. And then we're going to start with our first topic, which is what we're going to call measures of central tendency, which you probably heard of, but you've probably heard it more so called mean, median, and mode. So when it comes to data, we have two types. Typically, we have single variable data, which its primary purpose is to just describe data. And that's where we use things like mean, median, mode, standard deviation. We might look at like a histogram or a box plot or a dot plot. And like I said, the goal is really to just describe data. It doesn't really analyze relationships between two variables because two variable data is what that is used for. Like two variable data deals with causes and relationships and correlations, and its purpose is to explain data. And so if you look at kind of the two examples I've given you here, if I talk about how long maybe it takes me to get to work, that would be an example of just one variable data, and I can calculate the mean, median, mode and find out like on average how long does it take me to get to work, what's the median amount of time that it takes me to get to work. Whereas if you look at a two variable example with data, I have an ice cream shop keeps track of how much ice cream they sell versus the temperature on that day. And so now you're comparing two variables, the amount of ice cream you're selling and the temperature on any given day. Okay. Then within our data, we also have types, like more specific types of data, such as categorical data, which means we place individuals into one or several groups or categories. So like you might be placed into a group based off your gender or your race or your hair color. And then we also have quantitative data, which are like numerical values, such as test scores, grade point average, age, your height, your shoe size. And so for our unit, we're really going to be focusing on quantitative data. Okay. So let's take a look at what we call measures of central tendency. In measures of central tendency, they're used to generalize data sets and identify common values. And they attempt to try to describe the set of data by just a single number. And so those numbers could be the mean, which sometimes you've heard called the average, or they might be the median or the mode. And those numbers represent the center or like a typical value of the data set. Okay. And they also indicate where most of the values in a particular distribution fall. So what we're going to do is let's just quick discuss mean, median, and mode, and then we're going to apply it to a problem. So your mean is the average of a data set. And so the way we calculate the mean is we add up all the data values and we just divide by how many data values we have in the set. Okay. Our mean is really useful when we don't have outliers. And so if I look at test scores and a majority of my kids scored 80s and 90s on the test, but I had two students who scored a 50. Those two students are kind of skewing my data. They're going to bring the mean or the average down because their scores are much, much lower than everybody else's. And so we tend to want to use the mean when our data is pretty evenly dispersed. We're not skewed one direction or the other. Now, our median is the middle number when we write our numbers in order. And so the median is best when our data is skewed, because if we just want to find the middle number, it'll kind of eliminate any outliers that I might have in my data set. When I want to calculate my median, there's kind of two ways I can do it. If my data set is odd, then it's really easy to find the middle number because you will legit have a middle number. But when our data set is even, we take the two middle numbers and we average them together to find the median. And then the mode is a value that occurs the most frequently. And we can have several different types of modes. We might actually have no mode where we don't have any numbers that are repeating themselves. Or we might have one mode where there's a single number that repeats itself the most amount of times. Or we could have several modes that are repeating themselves multiple times and it's the same number of times that they're repeating themselves. And the mode typically is best when we're talking about categorical data. I find that we don't really use the mode very much when we're talking about quantitative data. So what we're going to do is we are going to find the measures of central tendency in this data set, and then we're going to explain what those numbers represent. And so we're going to look at cereal and their sugar content. Okay, so what we're going to do is let's start with the mean. And when we look, we can see we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on each side. So we have 14 data points total. So when we want to find the mean, we're going to be dividing by 14. So to find the mean, we want to take and start adding up all of the amount of sugar that is in each of these cereals. So we'll add 12 plus 2, and we'll just keep adding all of those numbers up. So you can be adding these up in your calculator while I'm doing the same thing. So when I added all of mine up, I got that all of these numbers added to 124. Now, something else you can do too is because this data is in kind of like 2 columns, just the way it's organized, one thing that can be helpful if you feel like you get lost in adding everything up is you could add up each column. So that's kind of what I'm doing here, just as a way to double check myself, because sometimes it can be super easy to just input the wrong number into your calculator and you don't even necessarily realize that you did it. So if I add each individual column and then I add 67 and 57, I do get 124 again. So I know that these add up to 124, and I'm going to divide that by 14. And I get that my mean is about, and we'll go to the hundreds place, 8.86 grams. Okay, so then my median, now sometimes the median is best if you put them in order from least to greatest. Other times students might prefer to, and this is kind of what I do, is I'm like, okay, I start with my smallest number, which is a 2, and I cross it off. And I might go to my next, and then I go to my biggest number, which is 15, cross it off. Go back to my next smallest number, which is 3. Go back to my next biggest number on here, which is 12. And I keep going until I get to the middle. Some students kind of get a little lost in that. So one thing that can be helpful is for you just to take and put your numbers in order. So I'm going to start. I've got 2, and then 3, 4, and I have 2 4s. So I'm going to kind of cross them off as I list them in order. And then it looks like my next smallest number is 9, and it looks like I have 2 9s. And then I've got 3 10s. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 12s. And then a 15. And now that I've got them in order, what I can do is I can just start taking them off from the end. So take one from the very beginning, take one off from the very end. And I can just keep doing this process until I get to my very middle number. So let's say I've crossed off 4, 5, 6. And I see I'm left with 2 numbers that are the exact same. So that tells me my median is 10. And then I should say 10 grams of sugar. And then my mode is the number that repeated the most often, and 12 is the one that repeated the most often. So even though 10 repeated 3 times, the fact that 12 repeated 4 times means my mode is 12 grams. So when I analyze my measures of central tendency, I can say the mean is 8.86 grams. The median is 10 grams. And the mode is 12 grams. of sugar. And so that's just purely calculating those measures of center. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to analyze and talk about which of the three best represents this data. Because these values are all about 2 away from each other. So I have to decide which one seems to be the best representation of what's given in my table. So that's what we're going to learn in the next video.